Hello world, I'm Kay and welcome back to Game Sprite mode. Today we are going to be delving into part 2 of GameCube theory. Yay! In this video specifically, we are going to be discussing episodes in Season 2 that really flesh out the worlds inside of GameCubes. I will be building off of everything that was discussed in part 1, so if you haven't watched that, I suggest watching it before continuing with this video. Season 2 spoilers ahead, so if you haven't seen Season 2 of ReBoot, I also suggest doing that before watching this video.
What you are experiencing is a temporary distortion of reality.
Just a little bit of background information on Season 2 before we get started. Season 2 was 10 episodes long, which is a little shorter than Season 1, which was 13 episodes. Of the 10 episodes, only 4 of them have games present in them, which is 40%, a small decrease from Season 1, which was roughly 61% of the episodes had at least one GameCube in it. But even though this was a shorter season and had less games than Season 1, there's definitely a lot to unpack. Season 1 really outlined the fundamentals of GameCubes, but Season 2 definitely expands upon what has already been introduced. So we're just going to dive in there. Going to be starting with episode 2 of Season 2, High Code. I feel like this episode is a really good refresher for the viewing audience. It really goes over a couple of the major things we learned in Season 1 and brings it back to the forefront. In this episode, a codemaster from the net comes to Mainframe searching for Talon. It's later revealed in the episode that Talon is in fact in Mainframe, but has decided to give up being a codemaster and just wants to live a normal life. So naturally, Bob and our main cast decide that they're going to protect Talon and try to get rid of this codemaster to save their home. Later on in the episode, GameCube drops, and Bob decides he is going to trick this stranger to go into a game and deliberately lose with the intention of having them both nullified in order to save Mainframe. This right here really reminds the audience that it is life or death. Games are high stakes. If you lose a game, then that's it. There's no do-overs. We see later on in the game the stranger use his Gibson coil pike, or attempt to use it in a game, but it has no effect. This is reminding us that you can't use outside weapons or objects inside a game unless you reboot and they're reformatted some way to adjust to the rules and laws of game space. The next few episodes really go hand in hand and have similar themes, but I will be starting with episode 3, When Games Collide. The episode begins with our main characters inside a GameCube. They're playing a generic kind of alien combat game. While they're in there trying to defeat the user, Megabyte has his goons hack and slash attaching a leech command to the outside of the GameCube in an attempt to steal its energy. Immediately once the leech command starts absorbing energy from the GameCube, we can see the effects inside the game. Bob, Dot, and Enzo notice that the speed dramatically slows down and of course have no idea why it's happening. Later on in the episode, a basic combat game is played by the user. And while Bob's inside, hack and slash once again have the leech command stealing energy. But this time, too much energy is taken from the game and it crashes. This triggers a manual restart by the user. A new game is then loaded in on top of the pre-existing games. This causes both of the game worlds to merge. So you have these combat elements with like this dinosaur Jurassic Park kind of twist, which is very amusing. In episode 4, we see a game malfunction for a very similar reason, but still differently. In the previous episode, we saw a direct correlation from energy being drained from a game and it affecting the internal components. But in Bad Bob, a lot of the issues stem from the fact that a game was loaded into a system that was low energy. In this episode, Megabyte attempts to steal energy straight from the core. He's successful, but then, when a GameCube tries to drop from the sky, we see that it's heading towards where the energy is. Prior to this season, GameCubes seemed to be this mysterious, scary thing sent by the user that sprites didn't really know all that much about. But the more that's revealed, the less scary they become because you begin to realize that they're just a part of the net like everything else. We see through episodes 3 and 4 that they're just as reliant on energy as everything else that exists. And without it, they become vulnerable. We see in When Games Collide that the GameCube didn't have enough energy to sustain itself, which caused a lot of problems for the internal aspects of it. And in Bad Bob, we saw firsthand what happens when a game's loaded into a low-energy system. Both of these issues and malfunctions were direct results from not having enough access to energy. Now, we've already got a couple hints suggesting that GameCubes are a little more living and organic and reliant on the net than first thought. Moving on to episode 6 of this season, however, Andrea, a lot more is revealed. In this episode, we actually learn more about the world and how complex it is inside a game, specifically with the game sprites that inhabit them. The beginning of this episode starts off with Bob in Space Race. A few of the binomes who are also in the game got in his way and really jeopardized the whole objective of defeating the user. So he decides to do a little seminar TED Talk thing to kind of refresh the memory of some of the mainframe inhabitants about how exactly games are dangerous and what they should be doing if they find themselves inside of a game. His little TED Talk was called Games, a Survival Guide. The beginning of this little spiel Bob goes on really just reiterates information that we already learned in Season 1, defeating the user and a little bit of a recap on rebooting. But the most important part of his lecture was actually what we learn about game sprites. For the first time ever, it's broken down the different categories under which game sprites fall under. The first kind he talks about, he labels as aggressives, and these are game sprites that will only attack the user. The second kind are defensives and will stop anything that gets in their path. The third kind, which he specifies as the most dangerous, are chaotics, and they will attack anything that moves. The fourth kind, labeled passives, tend to reveal information about the game. And the fifth kind, which is the most important, artificial intelligence. These are game sprites that can learn and adapt to become better opponents for the user. So the game in this episode is a water game called Treasure of Atlantis. And in this game, we really learn a lot by seeing firsthand how sentient the game sprites in these games are. Prior to this, when we thought about games, the emphasis was always on the user. We have to stop the user. We have to beat the user. But for the first time, we're actually thinking about the other living inhabitants of the games. Later on in the game, Enzo befriends a small game sprite named Andrea. They soon realize that win or lose, Andrea's going to leave with the game, so they couldn't be together. So Andrea puts a backup copy of herself onto Enzo's icon, and the game let her out thinking that she was Enzo. This really brings up the fact that the worlds that exist inside of games don't just exist when a game is loaded into a system. Even when it leaves, the components of a game are still alive. Now, this leads directly into a conversation that's had in the beginning of episode 7, Nullzilla. There is no game in this episode, but I feel like this is definitely something that should be highlighted. In the beginning of this episode, Bob and company are performing experiments on nulls. Andrea, of course, is very confused by this. She doesn't understand anything about life outside of her GameCube, so she's wondering, why are you doing this? Bob kind of explains a theory he has that's really interesting. Bob's theory is that the game retains an encryption of all the sprites when the user wins in the form of a saved game. So essentially, the sprite that's trapped in the game could be recompiled if they win the game that nullified them to begin with. And in theory, leaving them whole and in mainframe. So the game that nullified the sprite could potentially bring it back. This once again has us thinking about what happens to games when they leave mainframe. Obviously, if game sprites can exist in these games, it's not outside of the realm of possibility that so can system-born sprites. And of course, all of these themes and the things that are introduced now play a huge role in a lot of the plot points in Season 3, which I will be getting to in my next video. Games are living, breathing, organic components of the net. Even though they're sent by the user, they still have to operate under the laws of the net. They're dependent on energy, and we saw several examples of that this season. And also the components inside GameCubes are alive, and they think, they feel, they are just as much sprites like the rest of the sprite scene in the show. Prior to this season, systems were very much at the mercy of the user. But the more you learn about games, the more you realize that they're not so scary. And this gives sprites an opportunity to regain some of that control. I really hope this video helped to build off of what I talked about in part 1, but also to shed some light on some of the more mysterious components of GameCubes. A lot of exciting things happen in Season 3, and I will be going over that in my third and final video of this series. So for now, stay frosty.